Hello and welcome back. So, there's something to be said about timeliness and being on topic when things are relevant. And if you're a Canon shooter and you're into new camera gear and so forth, then not long before I started recording this video and its release, Canon announced the full-on announcement of the 1DX Mark III. Now, let me say something right up front. I don't get gear from Canon to evaluate. They don't give me anything. They don't, I don't even get toys to play with a camera. I am just not that big of a photographer as far as, Canon and cameras go. In fact, this is not a 1DX. This is a 5D Mark IV, and it's sitting there because I'm shooting this in the interim of shooting a video on panos using this camera and setup, and I just jumped up here and wanted to talk about some stuff on the Mark III. So why do I think anybody should care what I have to say? Well, or maybe what I should say is, what do I have to bring to the discussion that all the photographers that have been given cameras by Canon to test and demo and so on and so forth, what do I have to say that they haven't said? Well, I'm a camera buyer. This is why I said I don't get gear given to me. I have to buy it with my own money. And so for me, that means I have to make very careful evaluations of the camera gear that's coming out, that's being announced, and that I might want to spend money on. And this means looking at features in the camera and how relevant they are sort of to my shooting or my work, and looking at whether that justifies the price. Now, I should also kind of mention, I don't think I'm really in the market for a 1DX. I used to shoot with a 1D Mark III back when the 1D Mark III was a relevant, brand new or state-of-the-art or current top-end Canon camera, and I liked my 1D Mark III. And there's a certain part of me that would like to go back to a 1D camera in some respects. The ergonomics in terms of the nose relief for the viewfinder is a little bit better than the 5D. The body is a little bit more compact because it has the integral vertical grip instead of me having to use an extra battery grip. The battery grip itself is a little smaller because it's, uses a slightly smaller battery instead of two batteries in a sled, that kind of thing. But my needs as a photographer and where the 1D series have gone have kind of diverged. To start with, I don't really need to spend $6,500 on a camera. The cost of one 1DX Mark III will buy me two 5D Mark IIIs, and the 5D Mark IIIs are more than adequate for my needs as a landscape and wildlife photographer. On top of that, I like having a little more resolution than Canon is putting in the 1Ds, although I'm going to talk about that in more depth or detail in this video. But suffice to say, the 5Ds have kind of been where I've been at. However, for the last two generations, the 5D Mark III and 5D Mark IV, a lot of the features in the 1DX have been Canon's brought down into the 5D line. And now, granted, as far as I know, there's no talk about a 5D Mark V yet. I'm hoping there is one, but it's an open question as to what Canon's doing. I haven't seen an awful lot of anything on the rumor mill about a 5D Mark V. But part of what I'm looking at in the 1D is features that I'm hoping they'll bring down to the 5D in some form or another. And to start that off, I want to talk about resolution. So there is a certain vocal contingent, I would say, of people in the online camera discussion community who are wailing and gnashing of teeth because Canon didn't increase the resolution of the 1DX from 20 megapixels to something higher. And when push comes to shove, I think there's a contingent of people that are photographers, maybe not professional photographers, but vocal online in the online community who have been bitten by the consumer electronics bug, which is if it's not got more, if next year's model doesn't have more of everything than this year's model, then it's not better. And to me, I'm perfectly happy with Canon sticking at 20 megapixels. And it gives me a glimmer of hope with the 5D or future 5D that maybe they'll stick at 30 megapixels or only increase the resolution marginally to say maybe 36 or something like that. Because when push comes to shove, resolution has more resolution creates problems. It helps in some respects. There are areas where having more resolution certainly does make a better camera and better images, but it's not something that's across the board just a positive move. Now, Canon, the way they have their line structured, they have the 5DS, and it's currently 50 megapixels, and there's talk that it'll be replaced with a mirrorless camera of the same sort of line that's going to be 60 or 70 or 80 megapixels. And to me, this is kind of the perfect way to go about resolution and, say, frame rate and performance and ISO capabilities and so forth. People that need a super high resolution camera can get a 5DS. The rest of us can use a camera that's got really good resolution, serviceably high resolution, but Canon isn't trying to serve every market simultaneously. And I think you see this in Sony's line with the A7, the R, the S, and the regular A7 having a spread over the resolution spectrum. You don't really see this in Nikon's line, where the D850 is trying to be the high-resolution camera and a high frame rate, but not pro-level camera. That I think that's a little bit more of a challenge. Now, technology has made it more possible. It's more feasible now to do something like that, but I think the benefits of doing that are not is necessarily let me put it this way. I think there's greater diminishing returns in just upping the resolution. So to sort of, Canon in their white paper for the camera kind of gives a wishy-washy answer about resolution and professionals not really wanting or needing more resolution. And I wanted to sort of put a more concrete perspective on this. So the first thing that many people, and again, like I said, this isn't more resolution equals bad. This is more resolution equals increasingly diminishing returns on the gain in resolution. So the first consideration that I would say is a real sort of thought process that a lot of people don't think about is one of the biggest limiting factors in looking at our photography and the ultimate end result of our photography is us, our own vision, the limitations of our vision as that applies to our ability to see a print or see detail in a print. And if you start playing around with the numbers and sort of the behavior of people, and you watch people in galleries and so forth, generally what happens is people want to see the whole print comfortably. So if you stand too close to a print and it covers or overlaps too much of your field of view, or is too large in your field of view, as your eye is moving around the print, it has to make gross or very large shifts to focus on the details as it moves around the print. And we know from eye tracking in computer studies and eye tracking of people looking at art and so on and so forth, actual scientific studies, that when you look at a picture, you don't just kind of blank out. Your eye moves around the picture looking at different parts, focusing on different parts. And so to view a print comfortably, most people tend, as the print gets bigger, to stand farther away so that it occupies about the same angle of view in their vision, or the same field of view in their vision, regardless of the size. So small prints are held up close, like in a magazine, and then large prints, like you might have in a gallery, people stand further back so that they can see the whole print. The consequence of this is, in general, and this is always a generalization, there's definitely, margin of error and room to argue, and certainly room to have more, more as a safety net. In general, you really only need about 8 to 12 megapixels to make a reasonably good print. A print that doesn't look blocky and splotchy and blotchy at normal viewing distances. And there's a lot of places where you can kind of see examples of this. Not having super high resolution when dealing with small prints, but or large prints, but one of the most notable in many respects is if you've ever had the opportunity to visit a gallery for Peter Lick. He is known for making massive prints, and his prints sell for quite a lot of money. And if you go in the gallery, the pictures are large and stunning and impressive, but if you stand close to them, they fall apart. They fall apart in ways that it's really kind of, well, it's just the reality of, even with, a 75 megapixel medium format camera, when you're making a print that's 10 feet wide and, or 15 feet wide and 10 feet tall, you can't stand 3 feet from it and not see how the image falls apart. Going along on the same sort of line, and I actually kind of feel a little weird, funny-ish talking about this, but film. Film for ages and ages and ages was the standard by which photography was done. And now, of course, now everything's digital, and there's a whole kind of, there's certainly a generation of photographers who never shot film. And so in some respects, I find, at least looking at discussions that I've had online, there's a lot of photographers who maybe haven't shot film that there's a mysticism about just what film was capable of. So I'm using data that was collected or derived by Dr. Roger Clark. I'll put a link to his page in the description below. But for 35 millimeter film, really good film stocks, and I'm limiting this to color because really that's what we're shooting when we're talking digital, but low ISO film stocks like, say, Velvia 50, for example, Fuji Velvia 50, really only had a resolution of 10 to 16 megapixels, depending on, how you measured it and various aspects and variables, and it might have been a little higher and a little lower, but not like substantially higher and lower. Kodachrome 64, which I've seen photographers talk about how, Kodachrome was such an amazing film, you could just crop in and in and in and in and preserve detail and so forth. Only had a digital equivalent resolution of 6 to 10 megapixels. Again, by Richard Clark's or Roger Clark's tests. Ektachrome 100 and Sensia 200, maybe 4 to 6 megapixels, and Provia 1600 was maybe 2 to 4 megapixels. In fact, in his tests, now what he was doing is he was scanning film using extremely high-end film scanners, and looking at the point where the detail that was being scanned was film grain and not information, picture information. So he's basically scanning down to the size of the film grains. And in his tests, he found that 20 megapixels, if you go through and look at his charts, 20 megapixels, or the 20 megapixels of the 1DX Mark III, would be about equivalent to medium format Ektachrome 100. That gave him about a 20-ish megapixel range. So there's while I wouldn't like rely on film as an argument, it does put in perspective like where we're at with a 20 megapixel camera. Is it's basically better than anything that anybody would have been shooting film stock wise in terms of resolution. And likely in terms of dynamic range too, because while there's a lot of mysticism about incredible dynamic range in film stocks, and people will make all kinds of well, if you flatten out the gamma curve and da 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 da, as this film stock could do 20 stops. The reality is you weren't ever getting that out of the film. That it's a theoretical number, it's not a practical value. And even in cases where you like Ansel Adams printing, where you were dodging and burning very specifically around the print in a very scientific and complicated and long time consuming manner, you still weren't getting the kinds of dynamic range that you get in a click, one shutter, one shot of with digital. But going beyond film and going beyond viewing, there's sort of a digital processing problem. So for the vast majority of the history of digital photography, pixels have been really important. The pixels themselves, like when you only have 8 million pixels, every pixel you have to think about in terms of sharpness and color and noise and so on and so forth. And possibly a consequent of that, or possibly just as a design ethos in the way image editors have always been written, they tend to think about everything in pixels. Sharpening is done in pixels, noise reduction is done in pixels, and so on and so forth. And so the result is that you get a high importance placed on pixels. Well, this translates in a lot of respects to the way I find photographers look at their images. And since you have to look at the image at pixel level for these kinds of things, you have to think about, or it's been ingrained in a lot of photographers to think about images in these at the pixel level. And so, like for a long time with low resolution sensors and this high focus in the post-processing workflow of focusing on the individual pixel level, one-to-one resolution or magnification, looking at prints, there's a real weight I find in a lot of photographers, at least when I talk to them in person about their post-processing workflows and so forth, put on pixel level sharpness, having pixel sharp images. And there's a direct consequence of this in the way increasing a resolution, or what increasing a resolution sensor does to the photographer's sort of approach, gear, and so on and so forth. And that's essentially that it places more demands on the lens, and it places more demands on the technique of the photographer. So it's not just we're throwing more pixels at it, but it's, with the photographers looking for pixel sharp images, they are focusing more on a smaller and smaller actual physical area in their picture looking, covered by those pixels. And so I've had friends who, when they upgraded to, for instance, the Nikon D850 or the Nikon D500, both cameras share essentially the same pixel pitch, but have different size sensors. They had a tremendous amount of difficulty with some of their lenses where they simply couldn't get the sharpness out of their lenses that they believed that their lens should produce. And they were coming to this from like 12 and 16 megapixel D700s and D4s, and even to some extent the 36 megapixel D800 and D810. They were coming to it from the results they were getting from those cameras and the demands of the much higher 46 or whatever it is megapixel D850 or the similar pixel pitch D500, made it where they were extremely frustrated with the quality of the images that they were getting. And in some cases, they went through replacing lenses that maybe didn't need to be replaced, trying to get sharper lenses to get back to that same pixel sharpness. The second aspect, of course, as I mentioned, was technique. Again, if you're going for pixel level sharpness, or maybe not even really pixel level sharpness, the higher the resolution of the sensor, the more demanding the sensor is when it comes to, say, camera shake of your technique. You simply can't shoot with the same sloppy technique and posture that you did, say, with a 10 megapixel full frame camera or a 12 megapixel full frame camera when you're using a 30 megapixel or a 20 or 30 megapixel full frame camera. And I can talk to this from experience. I went from a 10 megapixel 1D Mark III to a 22 megapixel 5D Mark III to now 30 megapixel 5D Mark IV. And every time I upgraded, I thought, it's the same thing. It's just like my old camera. I mean, it's better sensor, it's more resolution. This is awesome. And I'd go out in the field and I'd shoot pictures that would have probably been fine if I was using my old camera, but because of the higher resolution sensor in the camera that I was using, whatever it was that I upgraded to, when I came home and I put them into Lightroom and I started looking at the pictures, there was significant issues with camera shake. And even on my Mark IVs, when I have auto ISO on, I have the camera set to basically use a shutter speed, a stop faster than what the hand-holding rule of thumb would suggest. And of course, going back to what I said earlier about resolution of small format film, the hand-holding rule of thumb was empirically derived using film that never got higher than maybe 16-ish, maybe 20-ish megapixels. When you get to 30 or 40 or 50 megapixels, that rule no longer applies if you want, or if your focus is pixel sharp images. And of course, the final problem, and there's going to be a lot of sort of debate on how much of a problem this really is just more resolution equals bigger files. And that's more data to deal with. And I know there was a lot of people in the computer side of things, especially back when I spent a lot of time on tech forums and doing computer stuff, before I really got into photography. There was a lot of people whose mantra was essentially storage is cheap. And I mean, yes, it is to an extent, but there's also backing up your storage, and there's also redundancy if you want to be able to keep working while you, if a hard drive fails or something like that. And then there's the storage in the field. How many flash cards are you going to carry? How big of a flash card do you want to carry? I'm recording this right now on a 256 gig SD card, and as I've started shooting video and I've moved to having 64, 128, now 256 gig SD cards, I have to say there's a part of me that's always really concerned that that's a really big card. There's a lot of data on it, and if it fails, that's a lot of information that goes up in smoke, so to speak, without, a backup or redundancy or anything like that. And of course, to put some perspective on this, the 20 megapixel camera or sensor in the 1DX Mark III produces images that are around 20 megabytes. I've seen a couple of numbers, because Canon uses a compression algorithm, a lossless compression algorithm, because the images are compressed. The actual file size will vary depending on how much noise and how much detail is in the picture. So like a picture of a clear blue sky at low ISO will compress more than a picture of a busy grass field, or a picture just in general at high ISO where there's going to be more noise. But assuming approximately 20 meg an image, and assuming you're shooting at the full 20 frames per second the camera's capable of, That's 400 megasecond of data that you're throwing on your card. That's a terabyte, well, 1.2 or 1.2 gigabytes of data every 3 seconds. That's a lot of information, and that's a lot of frames to end up going through and trying to figure out which ones to chuck and keep. But I guess the sort of the short of it in terms of resolution is I'm not really upset or bothered by the fact that Canon didn't boost the resolution in the 1DX. And in fact, I really hope Canon takes this approach with the successor to my camera, the 5D Mark III. I would really like a 30 megapixel camera with a little bit higher frame rate, maybe say 8 to 10 frames a second instead of 7 frames a second, because it's just that much easier on me in terms of technique. It's that much easier in terms of the demands the camera places on the lenses that I need, and I really don't want to spend, another, I don't even know how much it would cost to upgrade lenses when I've already, spent, I don't know how much it costs to get high-end Canon glass. And in general, my experience, 30 megapixels is sort of more than adequate to make even fairly big prints, 20 by 30s or 24 by 36s or something in that range. And, so I'm definitely in the camp that I would like to see Canon not just boost resolution. I would like to see them keep the high resolution sensors in sort of a specialized camera system, like the 5DS, and keep the 5D line or the actual mirrorless successor to the 5D, because the EOS R, quite honestly, it may use the same sensor or a very similar sensor to the 5D Mark IV, but it is not the technical successor, the capability successor to the 5D Mark IV. It's a tier lower in terms of functionality. But I'd like to see Canon be a little more conservative with either keep the resolution or at 30 megapixels, or make only a small bump, not another 10 megapixel increase in resolution. So moving on from the sensor and resolution, I want to talk about the AF system, because again, this is something that Canon has brought from the 1DX and 1DX Mark II into the 5D and 3 Mark III and 5D Mark IV, and there's actually some, I think, really interesting things going on with the AF system in the 1DX Mark III, and there's criticisms that I leveled at Nikon when they launched the D5 with its AF system that I can't really level against Canon in the 1DX. So just a brief, broad sort of perspective overview. For lenses that have an aperture, or lenses and teleconverters that have an aperture of f5.6 or faster, there's 191 AF points available, and there's 155 of those are cross-type AF points. For compatible lenses with an aperture and teleconverters with an aperture of f8, there's up to 191 AF points available, and 65 of those are cross-type. And additionally, the range, the sensitivity range for the entire system has been expanded to -4 to +21 EV. So when Nikon launched the D5, they did the same kind of thing. It didn't have 190 AF points. I think they only went to 150 something. But they went to a really big number of AF points, and they made a big deal about how amazing all the, having all these AF points are. And they did two things in the process. They slightly expanded the coverage, but they did two major things in the process that I considered to be not that great. So one of them was they actually reduced the coverage of the AF system with f8 lens and teleconverter combinations. And the other was that the vast majority of the points that they added, that they made a big deal about all these new points, were actually assist points that the user couldn't select, use, or do anything with unless they were tracking something using the auto area 3D tracking or whatever the heck Nikon calls it. And conversely, while with the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV, while Canon didn't go to some crazy number of autofocus points, there was only 65, they expanded the AF coverage at f8 to the entire AF field, again, for compatible lenses. There were smaller areas for certain other options, but they expanded the entire f8 field to the lens. They expanded the f8 autofocus area to the entire field, and they didn't. So to me, and this goes back to, again, like I said, when Nikon released the D5, I wrote an article about this, that there's sort of a non-linear relationship between having more autofocus points, having more capable autofocus points, and how much utility you get out of the autofocus system. So obviously having one autofocus point is a whole lot more useful than having no autofocus points. And there's a pretty steep increase in utility as you add more points up to maybe, say, 19 or so, 15, 19 or something in that range. As you add more points to very low numbers of systems, it opens up a lot of opportunities for off-center compositions or better tracking. At some point, you get to a fairly dense grid across the whole AF area, and adding more points doesn't really give you more capability in terms of, say, tracking things. And I even went back when I was doing this article, I went and sat down and looked at like a lot of my pictures and a lot of how I would, how I want something composed. And for example, I was doing a lot of birds in flight at the time, how big in the frame I wanted the bird, how I wanted it composed, and so on and so forth. And there wasn't, even though there's gaps between the AF points, there wasn't a tremendous amount of, like, the head of a flying bird would span multiple points, even with the gaps, even in a 65-point system. Now, of course, adding more points certainly adds more sensitivity and accuracy to tracking things. It certainly makes it easier for the camera to track smaller things in the frame, and it certainly makes it, potentially more accurate because it can get more focus or distance information when it's tracking things. On the flip side, adding capabilities to go to f8 opens up a lot of possibilities. Now, you could certainly make the argument, yeah, but it's a professional camera and professionals don't need to have f8, lenses and teleconverter combinations at f8. But I don't really think that's true. I mean, yes, the kind of person who's more likely to buy a 1DX is also going to be more likely to own or be in the market for or willing to pay for a 400 2.8 or a 500 f4 or 600 f4 or even an 800 5.6. However, there's a lot of situations where you might not want to have a lens that big and heavy. And one of the interesting sort of things that's fallen out, at least I've noticed this in my own photography, of having cameras with really competent high ISO capabilities like I have in the 5D Mark IV, is I'm far more willing to carry a smaller, lighter lens, stick a teleconverter on it, take the aperture penalty, and shoot at a higher ISO than carry around a much larger, heavier lens. I mean, again, it's going to be situation specific, but if you're hiking any appreciable distance to get to where you're shooting, then the weight savings can be a big factor. And so a lighter lens like a 100 to 400 zoom or a 70 to 200 f4 or a 400 f4 diffractive instead of a much bigger, heavier lens like an 800 or a 600 can be a real benefit to, I mean, even professionals. After all, not everybody who's a professional is a journalist or sports photographer who can afford or has the luxury of, either having an assistant or having sort of constrained, like, they don't have to run up and down the sidelines at every game, or they don't have to, even more useful or accurately or whatever, they don't have to hike 15 miles up a mountain to get to where they're going to shoot their landscape or their wildlife. So while the Nikon autofocus system, I kind of lambasted for having a ton of focus points, but they were a lot of assist points, and having my real criticism was having smaller coverage at f8. The autofocus system on the 1DX Mark III isn't doing that. Canon is giving, from what I can tell right now, full coverage at f8 with, at least compatible lenses, which I'm going to assume is probably going to be a similar sort of setup to, what is on the 1D Mark II or the 5D Mark IV, though of course it could certainly be smaller. And interestingly, like I said, as I'm talking about this, I will include a graphic showing the autofocus patterns of the Mark III, the Mark II, and the Nikon D5. And if you note on the Nikon D5, there are some focus points I've colored red. Those are the ones that work at f8. All the rest of them only work at 5.6 and faster. And there's definitely there's an advantage in my mind of what Canon's doing. That said, one other thing I wanted to talk about the AF system in general is simply, I have to wonder if Canon isn't sort of exploiting their dual pixel AF technology. Now, I use their dual pixel AF. I mean, obviously I use it when I'm shooting video, because I actually do shoot these videos with the servo AF on, but I used it shooting stills when I was in Yellowstone with a 600 f4, and I found that it could snap things into focus incredibly fast. Not necessarily as fast as the phase detect system, but certainly very close to that. And while I'm not suggesting that maybe they're using dual pixels precisely, what they have said in their white paper is they are using a continuous area of pixels, a continuous, essentially it looks a lot like what an imaging sensor looks like. It's just a big blob of pixels. It's not individual stripes of, pixels for each AF point to have little strips of pixels. And I'm wondering with what they've learned from their deep dual pixel AF and how that works, I'm wondering if they're applying that to their autofocus sensor. It would seem to make some sense, and what little performance variations or limitations that show up, say, shooting in live view, because obviously the camera has to not only read the autofocus data out of the pixels, but it has to read the whole sensor out to provide an image for the, to the viewfinder, and it has to do metering from that image information as well. But having a dedicated processor and a dedicated sensor, there's no reason that that type of architecture couldn't perform as fast as the more traditional striped, aligned, phase detect autofocus systems in in this kind of camera. But anyway, moving from the phase detect autofocus system to the live view, the dual pixel autofocus on the sensor, there's two kind of big points that I noticed in the camera that I think are nice to take away. First of all is they're saying that it works to -6 EV. Now, live view autofocus, the biggest limiting factor is going to be sensor noise. As long as the sensor can produce a clean enough signal, the autofocus system should work. So I'm not quite sure what that -6 EV translates to, but I know in terms of actual light, that's pretty dark. The second interesting point I noticed is they've now expanded the coverage to 100% vertical and 90% horizontal on the sensor, which leaves two little margins along the left and right edges of the horizontal, of the sensor, but that gives a pretty good boost in coverage. I mean, compared to I think it's 80 and 80 or 80 and 90 or something like that in a 5D Mark IV. That's a pretty good boost in coverage to the top and bottom of the frame. I don't know how useful it is. I don't usually focus at the very extreme edges of my frame. It's not essentially, it's compositionally not a terribly useful area, but it is what it is. And the final point on their dual pixel AF is they're saying it works with lenses up to f11. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of Canon's live view autofocusing controls or system. In theory, if it's backed up with a contrast-based solution of some sort for the final acquisition or whatever, potentially live view based autofocusing should be able to focus with a lens at any aperture, f64. As long as enough light gets to the sensor should be able to read the contrast difference and find the highest contrast and therefore the in focus situation. Now, Canon may be so confident in their dual pixel AF, and it's certainly been spot on in my experience shooting with dual pixel AF in not only my 5D Mark IVs but the EOS M5, that they may not have a sort of a contrast backup solution, and so the f11 may sort of just be a actual limitation. That, like, if you had a somehow f16 lens combination or lens and teleconverter combination, it wouldn't work. Or it may just be that there is no currently supported configuration that Canon offers where you would have an f16 lens. That would be a f5.6 lens with a 2x teleconverter on it. They don't have anything slower in the EF series than 5.6 that I can think of, and that also supports a 2x teleconverter. And the current third generation teleconverters can no longer be stacked. There's optics in the way, so you can't stack a 2x and a 1.4x to get, that would give you an f16 aperture on an f5.6 lens. The last point I want to talk about with respect to the AF system is the new AF on swipey control thing. So Canon, as far as I can tell, I have not seen really good information on how exactly this works. I'm assuming it's probably touch sensitive, probably like capacitive touch sensitive, in the way that like a touchpad on on a laptop or the touch bar on the EOS R operate. And this, what they're marketing it as is a faster way to move your autofocus point around in the 191 point field. And instead of clicking the joystick on the back of the camera, you would just swipe your finger across the autofocus on button in the direction you want to move the point, or your active point, and it would glide across the field. I think the thought process behind this is something similar to the Touch AF that exists on, for example, the EOS R or the EOS M5 or M6 Mark II, or I think maybe even the 90D. With the no, I don't think it's on the 90, but certainly the R and the M6 Mark II and the M5, and there may be others that I'm not recalling correctly. That where you could use on those cameras, you can use your thumb on the screen, and when you're looking through the viewfinder, as the selector for your autofocus point, and where you touch and how you move your thumb on the screen determines, moves the AF point in the viewfinder. Now, I've not had tremendous amount of luck or success with Touch AF. I find it to be a little clunky. I don't know if it's because I don't have a tremendous amount of experience with it on the M5 that I have, or if it's simply a matter of, if I spent more time, I'd get used to it, or the area that it covers is not what I'm expecting or used to. But I find I have a lot of difficulty sort of accurately putting the focus point where I want it. I might be able to get it there in a gross sort of movement, and then I'm struggling to get it to the exact area position that I want it in. So I'm very curious from a user's perspective, and especially somebody who has not been able to use or play with one of these cameras. I'm very curious how this plays out from the user interface perspective. How accurate you can be with it, how easy or difficult it is to the thumb on the back of the camera. The thumb wants to move in this axis very easily, but this axis is a lot more difficult. The control precision, etc., is less, less accurate or precise. And so there's potentially, and of course, both of those axes are they're not perfectly horizontal and vertical. And so I'm wondering if, in my experience from trying to use my thumb sort of like within Touch AF on the EOS M, I'm wondering if that's going to cause some, it's a novel thing when it's new, but it ends up being sort of a level of frustration that it doesn't work as well as maybe you would expect it to, or you would want it to, as somebody who's using it regularly. My other big question with respect to this new autofocus sensor is, how does it perform when you have gloves on? If it's a capacitive sensor and you're wearing gloves, that's going to be a problem. And one thing, if you look at the user interface, because I've spent a lot of time looking at camera interfaces from a user interface usability study perspective. If you look at the user interface of the 1DX series, they're very much keyed to sort of like the worst possible case environment. They're much easier to use, and I can say this is true even going back with my 1D8 Mark III. It's much easier to use with big heavy gloves on, like you would have if you were out shooting in the Arctic or the Antarctic or at the top of Mount Everest or something like that. Because the controls are spaced further apart. There isn't necessarily primary and secondary functions on controls. The buttons that are on the top plate for ISO and so forth, like on a 5D Mark IV, are much closer together than the buttons on the top plate of the 1DX, and there are more of them on the 5D Mark IV than they are on the 1DX. And it's pretty notable when you're going back and forth between a 5D and a 1D or something like that, how much more spread out things are in that respect on the 1D, and how much easier it is to ensure that you're not misfingering buttons when you have gloves on and you're using gloves. Now, I don't necessarily wear tremendously heavy gloves a lot. I live in Florida. Florida tends to be hot. Gloves tend to not be something that, I'm wearing. That said, I also live in Florida, and when it gets cold, my fingers tend to get cold, and I tend to get cold a lot faster on a whole than somebody who lives in Michigan or New York State or Alaska or something like that. Biologically, I've become more adapted to hot weather than cold weather, and so that plays out in when it gets cold. I tend to have light gloves on just to keep my hands warm. So this kind of control, I'm very interested to see how it plays out when you have gloves on, or if you have to use capacitive, touch sense capable gloves for it to work, or if there's something more going on, or it's not actually using a capacitive touch sensor, it's doing something else. And sort of the final question I have on this whole thing is how important is it to the effective operation of the autofocus system? you know, it could be very important. It could be not so important. It's very hard for me to tell, obviously, not having used the camera, just from looking at the sort of, publicly available information. And wrapping up the autofocus system pretty quickly, there's one last thing I want to talk about, which is the new people tracking capabilities that they've added, which is specifically head detect autofocus. Now, I know that when I first read they got head detect autofocus in the camera, what kind of stupid, like, boy, can't Canon figure things out and get with the program. Then I started reading what the actual capability was, and it's something that I think is actually probably going to be more useful than people think it's going to be, or might think it is, in terms of just sort of reading the thing, straight out. So the idea is that the camera will be able to detect where a person's head is and focus on it if their face is obscured. So like somebody wearing a helmet, a full face helmet, or even a partial face helmet, or the example that they give in their example video is a dancer spinning, and when their face turns out of view, the camera locks on and stays tracking their head instead of jumping to something else. And as I said, I use autofocus, and this is head detect autofocus is available in both live view and the optical viewfinder phase detect system. Now, I've had problems in instances where, like doing one of these videos, where if I look down or turn slightly away or something, I've looked back and found the camera hunting for focus position because it lost my head and it picked something else to focus on, or lost my face and picked something else to focus on. And in theory, head detect autofocus would make this even more reliable, because if I turn around to demonstrate something, the camera will lock onto my head and keep focus where it should be, as opposed to focusing off into wherever it feels like. So the last, and maybe not least, but certainly the last point that I want to talk about are the video capabilities that Canon has introduced in the 1DX Mark III. And there's some things that I think real serious filmmakers are going to really have at. There's some things in the camera that, again, I want to repeat, I am looking at this from the perspective of a 5D user and what I would like to see, or how things may trickle down to a 5D Mark V or the mirrorless counterpart of a 5D Mark V. So there's kind of a lot to cover, actually, when it comes to video. And I think the best way to do that is to look at some charts that I've created. So the first chart here is looking at just the resolutions that are being offered. New to the camera is 5.6K. It's a 17:9 aspect ratio. The actual resolution is 5600 by 3730. And the camera will be able to record it at 60, 30, 24, and NTSC 24, as well as 50 and 25 frames per second in PAL. DCI 4K at 4096 by 2160, again, 17:9 aspect ratio. That's kind of the thing that I'm most familiar with coming from a 5D Mark IV, as that's the 4K format that the 5D Mark IV uses. It's also the 4K format the 1DX Mark II uses. So obviously it's going to be there, and the DCI format is the more cinema-oriented, you could argue professional, at least it's marketed at that. What's new is UHD 4K, which this is the consumer format, and this is something I'd wish Canon would just implement as a firmware update on the 5D Mark IV. Every video I shoot on my 5D in 4K, almost the first thing I have to do is take it into either through my my download workflow or my NLE, and crop it down to UHD. because nothing that I target uses DCI 4K as a resolution. Our TVs are 4K UHD. YouTube is 4K UHD, although I think you can maybe have DCI 4K, but then nobody has a 17:9 aspect ratio monitor. So it's useful if you're shooting, say, Hollywood stuff or something like that, but the extra, what is it, like 256 or something like that pixels of width doesn't really provide a lot of utility if you're not if your target is not a professional level sort of cinematography thing. And then of course full HD 1920 by 1080. The camera does up to 120 frames per second in that mode, and it's the consumer 16:9 option. What is not in the supported format list, at least that I've seen, is 720p, standard HD or HD, depending on what, who's calling it what. And one of the things I'd almost like to see, and maybe this is very much because of my workflow and the fact that I don't have storage and bandwidth to upload and displays. I'm not fully 4K on my displays. And even if I was, I don't find a tremendous amount of utility in 4K in a lot of cases. I would like to see like 2K or 2.2K to provide that little bit of buffer for shooting unstabilized or image stabilized with digital stabilization, which the 1DX will do digital stabilization of video when shooting video, but shooting with a combination of an IS lens and digital stabilization, or even shooting with in-body stabilization. There's a certain limit to how much a camera can actually stabilize video based on how you're moving it or how much you're moving it, that you can potentially get a little extra stabilization out of it in post-processing if you shoot with a slightly larger coverage area that then you can stabilize in post-process. Moving on from the supported resolutions, and this is kind of where everything gets really complicated. So here we're looking at, we're going to look at compression algorithms and bit rates and color depth. So 5.6K on the 1DX Mark III is all raw. And as you can see, it has some wicked bit rates. 2.6 gigabits for 60 frames per second video and 1.8 gigabits for 30 frames per second and lower. That is a massive pile of data. You're going to need terabyte or bigger flash cards. There's going to be people who are going to love that, but that is a crap ton of data. For both DCI and UHD 4K, so the first thing you might notice on this chart is the camera now supports compression with HEVC. That's H.265. It's a more efficient compression algorithm than H.264. And so it, in theory, would allow for smaller file sizes. In my experience, as I use H.265 as a format to upload to YouTube, largely because I don't have a tremendous amount of bandwidth to upload to YouTube, or upload bandwidth. I found that it halved the size for the same quality, or potentially even better quality. It halved the size of my upload files for the same quality as H.264. But if you look here, Canon is sticking with the massive bit rates, as much as a gigabit for 60 frame per second all-I in HEVC. Now, one thing to note and point out and pay attention to here is Canon chose, they would have two options. With HEVC, they could either make the files smaller or they could save more information. And they clearly went with the we'll save more information. So the AVC or H.264 files are 8-bit with 420 chroma sampling, subsampling, while the HEVC files are 10-bit with 422 chroma subsampling. So you do actually, even though the frame rates are still quite high, you do get a boost in what you're getting with the HEVC using that, as opposed to sticking with the older format. And then finally here we're looking at full HD, again, available with both AVC and HEVC, available in both Intra and IPB, and Canon even has a really low bitrate IPB Lite format that's 12 megabit for AVC and 18 megabit for HEVC. And I got to be honest, I'm not tremendously sure what the point of the IPB Lite is compared to the regular IPB when it comes to this. I think the idea is to generate HD proxies in camera, record those to the card, and then use the HDMI, which I believe, although I don't have the number right in front of me, I believe is 12-bit 422 chroma subsampled. Use the HDMI connection to hook up to a recorder and record a high bit rate on there. Simultaneously, it's me in the edit suite. One thing I want to draw your attention to, you'll notice there's no 24 frame per second options at 1080p. I also haven't seen if there's a option to like record 5.6K RAW to one card and 1080p in the light codec to another, so you have a proxy for the 5.6K, because it is a dual slot camera, and in theory it could support doing that, but I haven't seen that in the documentation. So additionally, Canon is going downsampling for pretty much everything. There is a crop mode. It's in 4K. It supports a crop mode. It's a 1.3 to 1.4x crop. Its intent, as I understand it, is if you're using Super 35 lenses with an EF mount or whatever, the crop will give you a 4K image inside that frame, but that's kind of really the intent more than anything else. Otherwise, the standard 4K and 1080p is supposed to be downsampled from the 5.5K sensor. Now, again, you know, when it comes to video, I know I'm a little bit of an oddball in some respects. I don't have storage space, and I'm not for a tremendous amount of data. Putting RAW, as fun as that might actually be to shoot in the camera, I can't say is something that I'm tremendously, you know, looking at using or would be looking at using. In fact, I've been looking at cinema cameras for a while now because of the 30-minute time limit that Canon imposes on their DSLRs, and one of the ones that comes up that I really am interested in is the Blackmagic Pocket 6K. And the problem that I keep running into with that is all of the recording options generate far more data than I'm equipped to reasonably handle effectively. And that's kind of the problem I'm seeing with the options that are in the 1DX Mark III. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them generate far more data than I'm really able to effectively handle. And while I wouldn't want to go down to, say, 720p, I prefer shooting at 1080p, and the camera does support that. What I did find notable is the 1080p options are kind of limited. Like, you can't have cropped at 1080p. You have to record 4K and then downsample it after the fact. At least that's what I'm seeing in the specs. There may be something else like that. So personally, I really would like to have the crop option for both 4K and 1080p or full HD. Otherwise, there seems to be a lot of, like, I really like the fact that they're including HEVC. It's a new codec. It's a very efficient codec. And, you know, in some respects, this goes too. I'd also kind of like to see, I understand keeping support for AVC, for the older standard. There's some video NLEs that can't support or don't support HEVC. And so, you know, you'd want to be able to record to that older compression algorithm. The problem that I run into is I'd really like to see the settings sort of separated. Maybe not, say, supporting 10-bit and AVC, but I would like the option to be able to set bitrate, algorithm, and chroma subsampling kind of independently. So, you know, maybe I'd rather shoot HEVC at 422 and 8 or 420 and 8-bit and knock the bit rate down some compared to what Canon is currently giving. You know, so maybe 420 at 20 megabit in HEVC at 1080p should give me the same picture as 420 at 30 megabit does in AVC, the older codec, H.264, while saving me 30%, 33% of my file size. And again, for me, file size kind of becomes an important factor. It's something I'm always having to like think about, deal with, and, you know, consider. And I'd like potentially the option to make some trades on that. So, and not necessarily, so as I said, I'm doing this, I'm speaking in terms of what I'd like to see come to a 5D Mark V. I would not be surprised to see the same kind of limitation in terms of RAW or the high frame rate stuff as it currently exists. So I would not be surprised to see a 5D Mark V not support RAW 5K video or 5.6K video. I would not be surprised to see a 5D Mark V not support 60 frames per second at 4K. I'd almost not be surprised to see a 5D Mark IV not support HEVC or have knocked down bit rates compared to the 1DX. Although, looking at their AVC bit rates and comparing them to the bit rates that Canon uses currently, they haven't changed the bit rates, so I don't really think that the Canon would knock bit rates down. But I can see them sort of curtailing some of the higher end features as a 1DX thing, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm certainly excited based on what Canon's showing here for video options in a 5D Mark V. I would love to shoot, again, like I said, cropped 1080p at, you know, Super 35 cropped 1080p. I'd love to be able to shoot 4K that doesn't burn through a 128 gig or 256 gig card in an hour of recording. And, you know, again, while, you know, Canon was blasted on the 5D Mark IV for 500 megabit 4K video, largely because people were looking at it going, well, it's motion JPEG and 500 megabits, and that's stupid, which should be H.264. If you look at what they're putting out on the 1DX, 4K all-eye in either AVC or HEVC is 470 megabits. It's basically the same bit rate as what Canon did in the 5D Mark IV and the 1DX Mark II for the, you know, those files, or those sizes. So, you know, that's always the struggle, I guess, when dealing with video, is finding the right compromise between how much size you can have and how much, how big the files are and how good the image quality is. And I do think in some respects that maybe one of the things that I've always said, and it seems to be the case when it comes to Canon's the 5D and 1DX, is Canon's thought process in these cameras with video seems to be more akin to cinematography and Hollywood than, say, journalism or like YouTube production or smaller scale professional videography type production. That they're very much geared to super high bit rates, much more so than the you necessarily need, say, going to YouTube. And you could even compare this to some of their professional camcorders that shoot like 45 megabit H.265, and that's the standard recording bit rate for 1080p on a professional Canon camcorder. And I don't see a lot of people complaining about it. And 4K, I think, goes up to 200 megabit or 100 megabit or something like that. And you've got that on these cameras. You do have 1080p at 30 megabit or 45 megabit, and you do have 4K at 170 megabit or 120 megabit. I don't know. It's one of those things that the more I do video, the more difficult I find it is to find the right balance or understand the right balance, especially for me. Like, I can clearly see, like, if you're a Hollywood production or you're a TV show shooting 5.6K raw, and who cares what the bit rate is, because terabyte cards are, perfectly within the budget. But, for a lot of the rest of us, that's probably not quite as practical. So anyway, these are my sort of thoughts on the 1DX. I would love to know what you think. Please leave a comment below about what you're excited about with the camera, or what you think it holds for future Canon, other professional level cameras like the 5D Mark V or the EOS R that's slated to, that's rumored to be coming along in the same kind of vein as a 5D. So yeah, please drop a comment, join the discussion. I'd love to hear what you think. If you like this or are interested in more content on photography and videography, I'm currently doing a long-running series talking about my experience actually trying to get started shooting videos at a serious high level, using DSLRs and so forth, for, the whole ramp up for production, video, audio, post-production, etc. Please subscribe. I would love to have you join the channel. And until next time.